مرحبا بكم مشاهدينا في حوارات السياق. زيارات رسمية متبادلة بين الإمارات وتركيا تأتي بعد نحو عقد من القطيعة السياسية بين البلدين وصلت حد تهديد الرئيس التركي بسحب سفيره لدى أبو ظبي العام الماضي بعد توقيع اتفاقية السلام بين الإمارات وإسرائيل. معهد دول الخليج العربي في واشنطن سلط الضوء على زيارة الرئيس التركي رجب طيب أردوغان إلى العاصمة الإماراتية في أبو ظبي، قائلا إنه كان من الصعب تخيل مثل هذه الزيارة خلال معظم العقد الماضي. عموما للمزيد من المتابعة حول هذا الملف ينضم إلينا الدكتور حسين إبيش كبير الباحثين في معهد دول الخليج العربية في واشنطن. دكتور حسين مرحبا بك معنا. بعد تبادل الزيارات هل نحن أمام مصالحة حقيقية للعلاقات التركية الإماراتية؟
I think so. I think the biggest issue that came between the two countries, which is the question of the Muslim Brotherhood and Sunni political Islamism in general, is more or less resolved because I think that in the past few years the Brotherhood project has collapsed effectively in the Arab world. The Shia Islamism is still strong, but the Sunni Islamist movement, the Brotherhood movement, even the jihadist so-called groups are in really dire straits now. So I think there's really not much that Turkey or Qatar also could do trying to cobble these groups together into a network. They're not, that whole fear is not a threat anymore to most of the Arab countries. And it was the UAE mainly on the other side saying no to political Islam across the board. And that angered, of course, Turkey and to some extent also Qatar. And it led to 10 years following the uprisings of 2010, 2011, and the wars in Arab republics. It led to a decade of confrontation, argument, bitterness. It was in two phases. The first between 2011 and 2013 or 14, where there was really a concern about a wave of Muslim Brotherhood governments coming into power after the uprisings. And then after that, between 2014 and about 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, concern about Turkey and Qatar trying to build a regional network, something like Iran's network, maybe not as coordinated, not as integrated, but something like that among Sunni Islamist parties. And both of those projects have failed. So since they've failed now, I think Turkey and Qatar need to find other ways of pursuing their interests because that door is closed. If they're going to use other ways, then the big argument with UAE and to some extent with Saudi Arabia and others, Egypt certainly is gone, the biggest obstacle to better relations. So yes, and at the same time, I think Turkey needs financial support desperately. UAE is looking to invest regionally. Turkey can help UAE access a whole bunch of markets, both geographic and sectoral in Africa and elsewhere where the Turkish business community is very strong. And there's no reason for it not to go forward. The other big change is the stalemate in Libya.
بالحديث عن موضوع ليبيا، تركيا والإمارات على خلاف في مجموعة من النزاعات الإقليمية لا سيما في ليبيا، هل حلت هذه الخلافات؟
Well, it's not solved, no. But I think there are two things that have happened. One is both sides, the government in Tripoli and Misrata, on the one hand, in Western Libya, and the government in Benghazi and Tobruk in Eastern Libya tried to overthrow each other between 2017 and 2020. First, on the eastern side, tried to take over Tripoli, and Field Marshal Haftar besieged Tripoli, and there was a big intervention to save the GNA government in Tripoli for various reasons, including ideological ones, by Turkey. And then, having won that battle, the GNA forces, and many of them are Islamist forces around the Tripoli regime, tried to go further, take over the oil crescent in Libya, and try to go forward towards Benghazi and Tobruk, and that did not happen either. So what you have then is a stalemate, almost a little bit like between the West Bank and Gaza among Palestinians. Neither the PA can take over in Gaza, and neither Hamas in the West Bank. So they just glare at each other but nothing happens. I think some similar kind of uneasy stalemate has emerged that is pretty long term in Libya. And as long as that fighting is not going to be taking place, and both Libyan sides have their chunk of the country, and now they're arguing over political processes and how to divide the oil money and whether to have a presidential election and all this stuff that is not of great interest in Ankara or Abu Dhabi or Cairo or Doha or anything like these are really Libyan arguments. Well, then the whole argument in Libya for the time being is resolved, practically speaking.
البعض يرى أن ركيزة العلاقات بين البلدين ستكون الاقتصاد، وأن أردوغان تراجع عن مواقفه لجلب الاستثمارات الإماراتية ولدعم الاقتصاد التركي.
So it's a very good question. This is really an excellent question. I don't see this as being driven by economics, although the Turkish lira collapse and Turkish economic crisis gives an opportunity for countries like UAE and probably, I think, later on this year, Saudi Arabia will, in all likelihood, also start looking into this very carefully to make investments that are profitable and that also give Turkey positive incentives to work with these countries and reduce the level of threat of Turkey as a potential hegemonic force that would, start throwing its weight around the region and behaving in a kind of authoritarian way or let's say an abusive way. I think there's a real possibility for investments and especially infrastructure, physical infrastructure. If you start uniting electrical grids, building pipelines, things like that, countries have to think very carefully about whether they want to get into conflict. So, for example, one of the biggest disincentives for Russia right now regarding Ukraine is the Nord Stream pipeline to Germany. It will be canceled if Putin invades. This is a good example, a dramatic one, of how infrastructure can change calculations, right? And now, having said that, the origin of this reconciliation is not economic. The origin is political. If the Muslim Brotherhood was still a threatening force in the region, and if Turkey and Qatar were seen as guiding it in a way that was nefarious, I don't think the boycott of Qatar would have ended in December of 2021 and 2020, excuse me. And I don't think that the Erdogan's visit would have taken place and all this investment would be going on between UAE and Turkey, and I think Saudi Arabia and Turkey to follow. But it did. So in other words, the removal of the main political irritant allowed countries to look at each other again. Turkey to welcome investment and infrastructure funded from the Gulf, UAE to look at Turkey and say, well, this is, we can make money here, we can, get access to markets all over parts of the world we don't operate in, but they do. And we can create new incentives for Turkey to think twice about again threatening our interests. It's a little bit like tying someone up in a way. It doesn't stop them from acting. I mean, Ankara is very powerful. Turkey is a very, very powerful country. And if they really feel the need to do something, they will. But it's a good idea to give your adversaries every reason to be friendly rather than go back to confrontation. And I think that's the smart move. But I think it would be wrong to see this as driven by economics, and then the economics buttresses the politics. It's the other way around. I think it begins with politics. That opens the door for economics that then adds new positive considerations to the politics. I think you can also note the difference between the UAE's approach to Iran, negotiations with Iran, and the Saudi approach, the Baghdad process that the Saudis are. The UAE engaged much more quickly with Iran than Saudi did. They've gone further with the Iranians than the Saudi did. They have, all kinds of interests Saudi Arabia doesn't have, like especially Dubai's commercial relations with Iran, etc. But more to the point, UAE is a small country, very powerful country, but a small country, and it doesn't have the same level of global Islamic and regional Arab role, and it doesn't have the same political complexity as Saudi Arabia. So UAE is nimble, it's agile, it can move quickly. Saudi Arabia is big, its calculations are complicated, internal, and all the politics, and what's this one going to say, and what are the religious conservatives, or the middle class, and of course, how is it going to impact at the OIC and vis-a-vis Turkey and Iran and Malaysia and Indonesia and Pakistan and all the other countries that claim some kind of Islamic leadership role. So these are all considerations that weigh heavily on Saudi Arabia that are not really there, at least not much for UAE. And I think UAE has specialized in moving quickly and decisively. And during this period of de-escalation that we see that everyone is engaging in pretty much. I mean, the only regional conflict that has not de-escalated is the shadow war between Israel and Iran. Everything else has de-escalated to some extent. Local conflicts go on in Syria and Yemen, etc. But the regional confrontation, there is de-escalation. The first country, I think, to really announce that to let it be known that this process was happening in a dramatic way was the UAE when they initiated the Abraham Accord opening with Israel. I think that was the first moment that de-escalation became, publicly and obviously a thing, a phenomenon. And I think also that UAE has embraced this idea of de-escalation more enthusiastically than any other country. Maybe the other one is Turkey, in fact, because Turkey was, in many ways, the most powerful country in the region. It also was the most overextended. It quarreled with just about everyone, except Azerbaijan, Hamas in Gaza, the GNA in Western Libya, and Northern Cyprus and Qatar. That's a small list. That's a very small list. It was having fights with absolutely everybody, including Washington, Moscow, all the other Middle Eastern countries, Iran, Saudi, Egypt, everybody. And with troops in Syria, troops in Iraq, troops in meddling in Turkey, in Libya, in the Caucasus. Even a powerful country cannot be on terrible terms with everybody and directly or indirectly involved in like 9 wars at the same time. This is preposterous. So I think they have every reason to pull back, and they are doing it. So this, in a way, is a big reconciliation between the two countries most enthusiastic about de-escalation. The least enthusiastic is Iran and its network of militias. The Houthis obviously perfectly prepared to not only continue the Yemen war, but to take it into the region. I think the Assad regime in Syria is not finished trying to reconquer all of its territory. And there are other actors in different places, the PMF groups, Hashd al-Sha'bi in Iraq, etc. are not, many of them are not finished with fighting. So the question then will be, how much space do regional actors really have? Or to what extent will these conflicts chase them? And you could say, I'm not interested in your conflict, but the conflict might be interested in you. We will find out.
هذه الحماسة التي تحدثت عنها فيما يتعلق بخفض التصعيد، لماذا لم تنطبق على مصر؟ بعض التسريبات تتحدث عن تراجع للخلف في المفاوضات بين البلدين بسبب رفض تركيا تسليم عناصر من جماعة الإخوان للقاهرة.
That's a really interesting question, and I do think there are obviously limits. So for sure, both with Turkey and even also with Qatar, to a lesser extent, it's still true of Qatar, there are opposition figures from Arab countries, especially Islamists, but not only Islamists, but especially Islamists, who have been based in Turkey and also in Doha, but mostly in Turkey, who remain harbored by those regimes, who remain as welcome guests there. And this is a very big irritant to many countries, to Egypt, to Saudi Arabia, to UAE, to many, actually quite a few countries who would make this complaint. So then I don't think Turkey is really willing to expel people. And even Qatar got rid of some people. Even Qatar just kind of pushed some people out. And mostly they went to Turkey, actually. I don't think Turkey is willing to get into the level of individual political figures and say, okay, fine, to make you happy, we will throw this person out, or we will arrest them and give them to you, or we will send them to Canada or something. No, I don't think they're going to go there. So it's a question of then, how do other governments, like the Egyptian government, in this case, react? And I think that's probably more a question for President Sisi than for anybody else, because I don't think you're going to be able to convince Ankara to get into a long list of people who are wanted or disliked or accused of crimes and turn their back on them. They haven't really been doing this, and I wouldn't expect them to do it. So if you make this a precondition, then there'll be a real limit to reconciliation. It is true. It's one of the outstanding arguments, and I think the Qataris moved pretty adroitly to get rid of the worst offenders that would have proven the same kind of thing between them and the Saudis, the UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt. Turkey has more of an ability to say, look, no. And I think that's where they're going to draw the line.
تحدثت عن انهيار مشروع الإخوان المسلمين في المنطقة وكيف اقتنع أردوغان بذلك وهو ما مهد الطريق لإعادة العلاقة مع الإمارات. هل تعتقد أن قطر شريكة تركيا في هذا المشروع وصلت إلى نفس القناعة عن انهيار مشروع الإخوان في المنطقة، أم أن قطر مشروعها بالنسبة للإخوان تكلفته أكبر من التخلي عنه مهما كانت الخسائر؟
Both countries probably hope that there will be a revival of Muslim Brotherhood parties in some time in the future, but it's aspirational. It's hard to imagine exactly how that would happen. Now, you could easily say, all right, most of the grievances of the Arab Spring that were legitimate grievances about governance and transparency and accountability are not really resolved. And therefore, they may come back at some point. And if they do come back, maybe some other version of Brotherhood style Islamist something could be part of the mix of a push for change. This is not impossible, but there's no evidence of it. It's not going to happen in the near future. And you cannot make your policies, center your policies on an idea that something maybe could happen at some point in the future if everything is right and nothing else goes on. This is intellectual speculation. And there's no way to know if it would happen or not. It's definitely within the realm of possibility, but expecting it anytime in the foreseeable future so that you can have a policy based on it, I think is not possible. Now, I do think the Qataris cling to their media strategy of populism, where they have always tried to go to the lowest common denominator, whether it's an Islamist one or pan-Arab nationalist one tinged with the Nasser rhetoric or Ba'athist rhetoric or something. They had both of those all the time, not just Al Jazeera, but all kinds of publications. Some of them, mix them together, like the old Al Jazeera in Arabic did, really mix them up. And others are more clearly, kind of like Arab nationalists and kind of Watani and Qawmi in the Azmi Bishara sense, or they're Islamists, So you have both of those, okay. Fine, that's great. But it's not effective anymore. That's the point. The point is not that the Qataris have abandoned any of that, though they did tone it down, but they haven't abandoned it. The point is it's not a threat anymore. There's nothing, it's smoke into the air. And particularly, the main thing that the Saudis achieved, particularly Mohammed bin Salman achieved in the boycott, was to break the reputation of Al Jazeera, which was already in trouble, but it really got badly damaged because so many people in Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Gulf took a different look at Al Jazeera and said, oh, this is Qatari propaganda. I get it. This is not Arab stuff. This is not Islamic stuff. This is Doha's propaganda. And it damaged their reputation very much. And there's an effort in Riyadh to grab nationalism and populism and Saudi first and the flag, move beyond the Islamic thing, but also gain control of the populist narrative with Saudi media and friendly other media, Emirati media, or other media that is not, aimed at overthrowing the government or criticizing at all times the government in a very ideological way. I think they succeeded in that. I think the grip of, before the boycott, Qatar still had a pretty good grip on populist demagogic narratives in the Gulf and in a lot of the Arab world. And that was not true. By the time of December 2020, no. So that's so in a certain sense, even if Qatari media continues to push the Islamist line and the Watani line, pan-Arab thing, okay, so what? It doesn't threaten anymore. It did, but it doesn't now. And I think that's a very important distinction. If what you're saying is powerful, it's a threat. But if what you're saying is, just something, okay.
تحدثنا عن انتهاء المنافسة السياسية بين تركيا ودول المنطقة مع انهيار مشروع الإخوان المسلمين. ماذا عن المنافسة الأيديولوجية؟ هل ما زالت قائمة؟
No, definitely no. And that's one reason why it's going to be much harder for Saudi Arabia to open up to Turkey and to invest wholeheartedly and to essentially prop up the Erdogan personally and the AKP government because they are harassing Saudi Arabia at this global Islamic OIC level, in a way not in partnership with Iran, but in a similar way as Iran. Sometimes in partnership, though, with Pakistan, with Malaysia, Indonesia, some of these countries, right? Sometimes they gang up, sometimes they do it on their own. But there is a narrative that Erdogan has been pushing for many years that Turkey is the natural, obvious, only plausible leader of the Muslims, specifically the Sunni Muslims, but therefore it's a big majority, so not too concerned about Iran and Basra and southern Lebanon. The main bulk of the Muslims, Saudi Arabia has a very well-established leadership role, but Turkey is making a big push based on Ottoman history, on culture, and on capability. I mean, it really is true that Turkey is a country with power and development and capabilities that outstrips every other Middle Eastern state. Insofar as Turkey acts like a Middle Eastern state, that's the difference, right? So, I mean, Iran is not the power that Turkey is, and none of the Arab states are the power that Turkey is, but Iran and the Arab countries see themselves as Middle Eastern countries. Turkey is capable of seeing itself as Middle Eastern or European or Eurasian, Transcaucasian, or all of the above, and that dilutes the power somewhat, right? If Turkey is full on just Neo-Ottoman, Middle Eastern, that's it, then Turkey becomes an extremely powerful player. But its claims are based not only on Ottoman history and culture, but also on power, on capability. It's not a bad argument ultimately, and it is threatening to Saudi Arabia, and it will hold them back a bit. This is an argument definitely not over.
تركيا والإمارات شريكين تقليديين للولايات المتحدة في الوقت الذي تواصل فيه واشنطن ما يرى على أنه فك ارتباط بالمنطقة. هل يمكن للبلدين أن يتعاملا معا بطريقة مؤسسية حول حل أزمات المنطقة؟
Definitely, of course, every country in the world, especially in regions, volatile regions, including East Asia, Southeast Asia, and North and in the Middle East, etc., are experiencing a dangerous and confusing transition from a monopolar world to a multipolar world. Used to be, between 1990 and probably 2000 and 2005 or something like that, really clearly it was a US-dominated world. US do not have any rivals, and it still doesn't, but you can see that it's going to. China is emerging, Russia is reasserting itself, Europe may or may not become another global presence. There are other countries that are contenders. Brazil, India certainly could become very, very powerful. So, the old rule book and the old strategic map is going. And no one knows exactly what it's going to look like. There's a great instability and uncertainty. So that prompts everyone to look for strategic diversification. And for allies of the United States, which includes most of these countries we've been talking about, not Iran, but Turkey, Qatar, UAE, Saudi, Egypt, all allies of the United States. Some of them formal allies, some of them partners. They all believe the United States is pulling back from the region, but no one knows how far, because the US has not reduced its footprint. And it has a huge footprint in the region that is the legacy of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, mainly, and Afghanistan also before that as a staging ground. But really, if you go back before 2003, you don't find any American presence like that, and it's still there. So the commitment is huge, absolutely huge, in Bahrain, in Qatar, in UAE, in Kuwait, all over. It's just huge, especially in the Gulf region. And as long as there's that military presence, the capability of the United States to act decisively is not in question. What's in question is the will. And what basically comes down to, what does the Carter Doctrine mean? The Carter Doctrine in the 70s said we will protect all our friends in the Middle East, in the Gulf especially, from any external force. And then it was added, Reagan said internal force, whatever that meant. The definition of these words was never clear. But the point is, in the past, it was fairly clear that any major problem, any major attack would be met with American force. Now we have a number of examples. The Iranian attack on Abqaiq and Khurais, right, not answered by the United States, because Trump said, well, no Americans died, not our problem. And he really literally said that. We have the attacks on the UAE by the Houthis now. The US said, well, we'll send you more Patriot missiles, which is probably the right response. But I mean, in other words, it's hard to know when the American commitment kicks in. I still think it's totally obvious that if there were a ground invasion, like Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, yes, the United States would act, for sure. But what's the point in between a Saddam Hussein moment and Abqaiq and Khurais moment? We know Abqaiq and Khurais does not get a response. We can be sure that a Saddam-like invasion, that would get a response. What about in between? Well, we really don't know. So if you're not sure, then you have to look for alternatives. And they're all looking for alternatives, which is one of the reasons why UAE normalized with Israel to maximize it. One of the reasons Israel normalized with the UAE. So one of the reasons why Turkey is talking and everyone's talking, and de-escalation generally is more linked to overextension and exhaustion, and enough of 10 years of confrontation. It's just like everyone's kind of done. Maybe Iran is still willing to play that game, but even they are kind of tired. But that's temporary. The bigger picture of the need for strategic diversification is a semi-permanent reality. All these countries need to have more friends, more alternatives, more independent infrastructure, more defense industries, more of their own projects, so that they don't have to go to Washington every time. And if Washington says no, in a certain moment, they can say, okay, we have alternatives.
شكرا جزيلا لك دكتور حسين إبيش على المشاركة معنا في حوارات السياق. مشاهدينا، شكرا على طيب المتابعة. إلى الملتقى.